Story 1. The Wayfinders, Polynesian Navigation Without Instruments. You're standing at the edge of a low, palm-fringed beach. The sun has just dropped beneath the horizon and the stars are beginning to appear. There is no compass, no sextant, no written chart, only the rhythm of the sea, the formation of clouds, and the flight patterns of seabirds. This was how the ancient Polynesians crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, traveling from one dot of land to another across the vast Pacific. But how exactly did they do it? This story begins not with great kings or battles, but with the ancient practice of wayfinding, a slow, studied discipline built on generations of observation, transmitted orally from master to apprentice in chants, metaphors, and remembered sky patterns. Polynesians, specifically from regions such as the Marquesas, Samoa, and later the Society Islands, navigated the largest ocean in the world without modern instruments. Their voyages, which began over 3,000 years ago, were not the result of blind drifting, but of meticulous planning. Before the voyage began, wayfinders prepared for months. These were not common sailors, they were priests of movement, entrusted with the safety of their entire crew. They memorized the positions of more than 150 stars, recalling where they rose and set along the ocean's horizon. Unlike in the Western tradition, these positions were not given fixed degrees or coordinates. Instead, they existed in relationships. This star rises where that island lies. This cluster sets where the next landfall should be. In many Polynesian cultures, especially among the Micronesians and Hawaiians, star compasses were taught as mental tools. One famous example comes from the Carolinian navigators of Sadhawal, who used a system known as edak. In this practice, an imaginary island would be placed between the voyager and a reference star. The edak was not a location but a conceptual marker. As the reference star moved across the sky during the night, it helped estimate the canoe's movement across the ocean. But stars were only reliable at night. During daylight, other signs emerged: cloud types and colors, ocean swells, bird behaviors, and the color of the water itself. Low-lying islands, for instance, could not be seen from more than 10 miles away, but clouds often formed above them, casting a subtle shadow on the sea below. Different swell directions were memorized like the lines of a song. Swells could continue for hundreds of miles in a straight line and be felt beneath the canoe, even when the winds above changed. A skilled navigator could detect multiple swell patterns crossing each other and know, from the interference, whether they were drifting off course. Birds, too, were crucial indicators. Frigate birds rarely land on water, so their foraging range was limited to 50-60 miles from land. Naughty terns might circle an island and return each evening. A navigator might follow a bird's flight at dawn or dusk to determine the proximity and direction of land, guidance given not by map, but by memory. And still, perhaps most boring to an outsider but most vital to the navigator, were the palusami of rituals and routines. Coconuts were cut precisely, rainwater stored meticulously. Canoe maintenance was constant. Before departure, sacred chants were recited, not just for blessing but as mnemonic devices storing waypoints in the verses. Some chants were hours long. Each canoe was lashed together without nails. Double-hulled vessels, often 50 to 70 feet in length, used fiber ropes made from coconut husk sennit which could withstand long periods of exposure to salt water. These hulls held dozens of people and animals, carrying not just travelers but entire communities, planting new lives on distant shores. It's important to remember, Polynesian expansion was not random. The islands of the Pacific were settled in a purposeful directional flow. From west to east, beginning in Taiwan, passing through the Philippines and Melanesia, onward to Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, then out to the vast triangle marked by Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. All this without compasses, without writing, without charts. One way we know this is through the surviving oral traditions and reconstructed voyages. In the 1970s, the Hawaiian canoe hokulea was built using traditional materials and techniques. In 1976, using only traditional navigation, no compass, no GPS, she sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti. The voyage, led by Micronesian master navigator Malpiailug, proved what had long been dismissed by Western historians, that ancient Polynesians were not passive castaways, but skilled, intentional explorers. Still, many things remain unclear. How did early navigators store enough fresh water for weeks at sea? Were their star maps the same across islands or passed down differently in each region? Could navigation techniques differ between archipelagos, shaped by unique local conditions? And perhaps the most intriguing question of all, how did they decide where to go next, across such immense and uncharted spaces? You are now adrift, not in the sense of being lost, but in the true Polynesian way, deeply guided even in apparent emptiness. The sea stretches in every direction unmarked. There are no familiar landmarks, no floating signs, just the ceaseless pulse of water, sky, and instinct. This is where the real test of wayfinding begins, not at the shore, but in the silence between destinations. And that silence, curiously, was never empty. For the ancient navigators, each wave held orientation, each shadow a suggestion. The journey was not guesswork, but memory in motion. The star compass and the mind is map. The Polynesian star compass was not drawn, it was internalized. Unlike the Western concept of a fixed grid overlaid on the Earth, Polynesian navigation relied on a circular horizon divided into 32 named houses. Each of these corresponded to where a particular star rose or set. Imagine lying in a canoe, watching the stars rise like actors entering a stage from a precise doorway. You memorize the angles. You notice that Sirius, known as Kailua in Hawaiian, rises in the east and sets in the west at a specific point along your mental compass. You know that when it sets at that point, you are still holding your heading. Every movement of the sky becomes a check against your memory. Multiple stars are tracked, often in sets, so that when one disappears below the horizon, the next can be used in its place. This mental map requires training from a young age. Navigators would lie on their backs in canoes and memorize how stars moved across the sky throughout the seasons. They would sit in classrooms made of sand, drawing compass points with their fingers. Their teachers were the sea, the wind, and the elders who recited patterns over and over again. It took decades to become a master. But wayfinding wasn't just the domain of men. In some societies, such as those in the Carolines and Marquesas, women had roles in weather observation and memory keeping, particularly when voyages were intended for settlement and colonization, not just exploration. The calculated risk of colonization. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Polynesian voyaging is the assumption that it was random, simple drifting. In fact, much of it was exploratory, but not without safety measures. Voyaging corridors between islands were known. For example, the route between Samoa and the Cook Islands, or between Tahiti and the Tuamotus, became well-traveled. Voyages often happened in pairs. One canoe would go out, and another would follow later. This allowed a message to be returned home. Successful landfalls were marked in oral tradition. Failures, canoes that never returned, became cautionary tales and reminders of the ocean's indifference. When a new land was found, the first settlers often carried root crops such as taro, breadfruit, sweet potato, kumara in Aotearoa, and sugarcane. Chickens, dogs, and pigs were also brought along. The goal was not merely to explore, but to survive and reproduce. A new island had to be able to support not just one person, but a culture. Some historians believe that Polynesians explored and possibly even settled parts of South America before the Spanish ever arrived. The presence of the sweet potato, a crop native to South America on Polynesian islands long before European contact, remains one of the strongest clues of this early trans-Pacific interaction. The exact origin of the connection is still debated. Was it a one-time contact? Was there trade? Did Polynesians reach the coast of Chile or Peru? We may never know with certainty, but the mystery itself speaks to the extent of their travels. Reading the invisible, swells, refraction, and sky clues. While the stars governed the night, the daytime brought its own vocabulary of signs. Long swells generated by distant storms formed invisible highways beneath the canoe. A trained navigator could feel these with their body alone, sensing the shift of the canoe's tilt and rhythm. Waves bounce off islands even when land is not visible, creating subtle reflected swells. These interactions could reveal the presence of islands tens of miles away. The canoe might sway in a slightly different rhythm a second pulse, and from this, a navigator could infer an island's direction. Clouds played a similar role. Towering cumulus clouds often hovered above islands due to the heat and humidity generated by vegetation and landmass. Shallow lagoons reflected more light, coloring the underside of clouds in turquoise tints. Rain squalls could signal freshwater sources, while long, flat lines of cloud might signal settled air over wide oceans. Birds were especially watched at dawn and dusk. Migratory paths were known for species like the golden plover, whose annual journeys between Alaska and Polynesia stretched thousands of miles. Resident birds like terns or boobies became more active near land. If a bird flew off in a straight line at dawn, the navigator would follow. If it returned by dusk, it had gone to land and was now coming back to sea. These behaviors were repeated observations across generations. Each sign reinforced or corrected the others. A navigator would not rely on just one, but on a cluster of evidence: clouds, birds, swells, stars before making course changes. Cultural memory as infrastructure. What makes Polynesian navigation so unique is that it relied entirely on cultural memory. Without writing, this information had to be encoded in ways that would last. Stories, chants, rituals, and songs became vessels of knowledge. In Hawaii, navigators were part of a priestly caste, deeply respected and feared. They were trained from youth in isolation and often lived separately from ordinary fishermen. In Micronesia, knowledge was kept in house of navigation schools, secretive and limited in access. Some families guarded these skills across generations. The chants used by navigators were not just religious, they were data sets. A chant might list stars and their rising points, swell directions, and bird patterns. The rhythm helped with memory. Many of these chants were composed in metaphor, describing a bird's journey as a mythological flight, or an island as the face of a sleeping god. To forget a verse could mean the difference between life and death. To misread a swell could be fatal. But the discipline was also resilient. If one sign failed, if the stars were obscured, or birds misled, others could guide the way. When Maupiailug taught the Hokula crew in the 1970s, he lamented that only a handful of people still knew the old ways. The knowledge had nearly disappeared under the weight of colonial education and Western skepticism. What had once been respected became dismissed as primitive. But Mau proved it worked. By memory alone, he guided the canoe 2,500 miles to Tahiti, and then back. The larger web of settlement. As Polynesians spread across the Pacific, each group developed slightly different techniques, influenced by local geography. The people of Aotearoa had to adapt to colder climates. Islanders in Tuvalu relied more heavily on bird life and reef colors. Easter Island settlers had little to guide them back once they left. But the spread was not chaotic. Linguistic, botanical, and archaeological evidence shows a clear chain of transmission. Words for canoe parts, family relations, stars, and crops can be traced across islands thousands of miles apart. The lapida, pottery style found in sites from Melanesia to Samoa, marks the trail of expansion. By 1200 CE, nearly every habitable island in the Polynesian Triangle had been visited or settled, and all without iron, without wheels, without a written script, just rope, wood, vision, and story. So we return to the question, how did they decide where to go? Some believe it was the color of a bird's wing, a strange cloud, a dream interpreted by a chief. Others think it was deliberate an effort to relieve population pressure or explore new fishing grounds. Still others believe they were retracing ancestral paths, guided by oral legends of distant lands once visited, now to be found again. And yet, what happened when the journey went wrong? When no stars showed and the signs contradicted? When a canoe was lost and there were no stories to explain it? You are drifting once more, this time not toward a destination, but toward a deeper question. What happens when knowledge disappears? The sea, vast and indifferent, does not record what passes over it. Canoes vanish without trace. Names, if not spoken, dissolve. A navigator's life, like the ripple from a paddle, fades unless retold. So much of the Polynesian legacy was carried in voices, and when those voices were quieted, much was forgotten. The final chapter of this story is not only about the voyages themselves, but the slow unraveling of memory, followed centuries later by a patient attempt to stitch it all back together. The loss of the wayfinding tradition. By the 18th and 19th centuries, most traditional Polynesian navigation systems were either suppressed or entirely gone. The causes were many: colonialism, Christian missionary activity, and the adoption of European ships, which used compasses, sextants, and charts. These technologies replaced indigenous knowledge first slowly, then completely. In Hawaii, Tahiti, Aotearoa, and Rapa Nui, the ancient chants were no longer taught. Children learned to read and write, but not in their own languages. The star compass was replaced with the Western grid. The EDAC system of mental reference points was replaced by fixed coordinates on maps. And as these systems fell out of use, the navigators once revered were seen as relics, or even as ignorant. Western historians for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries dismissed the idea that Polynesians had purposefully settled the Pacific. Many suggested that the islands were found by accident castaways on rafts. The idea that these islanders could navigate across 10 million square miles of open ocean without instruments was treated as absurd. In their minds, only the West could conquer such distances with purpose. But this view ignored the deep ethnographic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence to the contrary, and it silenced generations of inherited skill. As elders passed, their knowledge died with them. Chants went unrecited. Canoes rotted in dry fields. The last masters carried secrets that no one asked to hear. Until in the 1970s, the tide shifted. Maupiilug and the Hokulea voyage. Maupiilug was from the small Micronesian island of Sadawal, just 1.3 square kilometers in size. He was one of the last traditionally trained Palu, or master navigators, who had memorized star paths, swell patterns, and bird migrations. From the age of 4, he trained under his grandfather. He had no charts, no compass. He knew hundreds of stars, their seasonal positions, and their behavior in different latitudes. In 1976, a group of Hawaiian cultural practitioners and scholars built the Hokulea, a traditional double-hulled canoe. Their goal: to prove that their ancestors had deliberately voyaged from Hawaii to Tahiti, 2,500 miles away, using traditional wayfinding methods. But there was a problem. No one in Hawaii knew how to navigate the old way anymore. So they turned to Mau. He agreed to guide them despite cultural and linguistic differences. He became the bridge between lost knowledge and revival. Without instruments, Mau guided the Hokulea through wind shifts, storms, and changing skis. He used the stars and swells, the flight of birds, and the color of water. After 33 days at sea, they arrived in Tahiti. Tens of thousands came to greet them. It was not only a triumph of navigation, it was a resurrection of pride. A people once told they had been lost were now shown to have been explorers. The voyage of the Hokulea lit a cultural flame across Polynesia. Canoe building was revived. Navigation schools reopened. Old chants were remembered. and young people, for the first time in generations, began to ask questions about their past. Mao returned home, but his gift remained. Before his death in 2010, he trained a new generation of navigators, including Nainoa Thompson, who would go on to lead the Polynesian Voyaging Society and guide future Hokulea journeys. Rediscovery and global recognition. Following the success of the Hokulea, a wave of scholarly and indigenous efforts began to recover the navigational past. Linguists mapped out Proto-Polynesian vocabulary for stars, canoes, and wind. Archaeologists traced Lapita pottery across Melanesia and into the Central Pacific. DNA studies confirmed shared ancestry between distant island groups, and anthropologists recorded the stories of the last elders who still held fragments of star lore. Voyaging canoes were rebuilt across the Pacific. In New Zealand, the Cook Islands, Tahiti, and beyond, navigators sailed once more not as reenactors, but as practitioners, not to look back nostalgically, but to remember what it meant to move forward across the unknown. The Hokulea later completed a worldwide voyage, circumnavigating the Earth to spread awareness of ocean health and indigenous knowledge. Along the way, it docked in ports as a floating classroom, its crew sharing stories of how ancient memories shaped a sustainable way of life. These voyages are not recreations, they are continuations. Legacy and the modern navigator. What then is the legacy of the Polynesian wayfinders? It is not just about movement, it's about how knowledge lives in the body, how memory becomes place, how a culture builds maps not on paper but in practice. Modern navigators, those trained in traditional ways, now speak of a felt sense of direction. Their methods are being documented and shared, but much of it remains experiential. You cannot simply read about it. You have to feel the canoe beneath your feet, hear the way the wind hits the sail, notice the tilt of the stars as they rise. Polynesian navigation is also increasingly seen as a model for ecological awareness. To sail this way requires attunement to tides, birds, currents, and climate. It means reading the planet in real time, without filters. It means knowing how much water you can carry, how long taro will last, and what the clouds say about the morning to come. In a world facing disconnection, such awareness is not a relic, it is a guide. A quiet mastery. There's something deeply boring about this history, not in a dismissive way, but in a quiet, careful one. The stories don't have battles. There are no conquests, no crowns, no speeches recorded for eternity. There are instead endless days of planning, coconut husks braided into rope, fish dried and salted, routines repeated, star positions recited softly to the sea. The heroism is in the discipline. The wonder is in the waiting. The success of a voyage may have rested not on daring, but on deep, persistent attentiveness to details others found too mundane to study. And that is what makes the Polynesian navigators extraordinary. They succeeded, not in spite of the sea's vastness, but because they never assumed it was empty. You now reach the end of this journey, and as you drift beneath the imagined sky of a warm Pacific night, you might wonder, if the stars above us have not changed, then what other knowledge lies hidden not in books, but in the lived silence between places? Story 2. The Post Roads of the Roman Empire. You wake on a worn stone bench beside a dusty road, somewhere along the Italian peninsula, sometime around the 1st century CE. The sun is rising, and in the distance the rhythmic clop of hooves echoes against the hills. A rider approaches, not galloping but steady, focused. He bears no weapons, only a satchel sealed with wax. His destination is not glory but the next mutatio, a roadside relay station, where he will pass his message and rest. This is not a dramatic scene. It is just one of thousands like it happening across the empire every day. A quiet, unnoticed act, but one that helped bind together the largest empire the world had yet known. This is the story of the cursus publicus, the Roman state's communication system, slow, methodical, and almost entirely forgotten. the birth of an administrative web. The Roman Empire at its height stretched from the coasts of Britain to the sands of Arabia, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Its survival was not based on brute force alone, but on an ability to coordinate, to communicate, and to respond. Letters, orders, census records, tax receipts, military reports all had to travel across immense distances. It was Augustus, the first emperor, who formally established the cursus publicus, or public way. Modeled in part on older Persian systems, this network of roads and relay stations formed the arteries through which the administrative lifeblood of the empire flowed. The system had two main components: vehiculatio, for heavier transport using wagons or carts; cursus celer, a faster courier system for urgent messages, usually using horses. What made this system work wasn't speed in the modern sense. It was reliability. Couriers could travel 50 to 75 miles per day, depending on the terrain. Messages from Rome could reach Gaul in under 2 weeks, a minor miracle in an age before the steam engine. Milestones, mansions, and mutations. Roman roads are often praised for their engineering. The drainage ditches, the layers of paving stone, the cambered surfaces. But less celebrated are the details that made them useful for couriers. Every Roman road was marked with milliaria stone mile markers placed every Roman mile, roughly 1,480 meters. These provided distances not only to the nearest city, but also to the next mansio, a rest station with beds and food, and mutatio, a horse-changing station. These milestones were inscribed in Latin, often with the name of the emperor responsible for their construction or repair. Mutations were usually placed every 12-15 miles, spaced according to how far a horse could travel at a consistent pace before tiring. These stations stored fresh horses and sometimes spare carts. Couriers would arrive, hand over their travel documents, diplomata, swap mounts, and depart. Time spent at each stop was kept short to preserve efficiency. Mansions, spaced farther apart about every 25-30 miles, provided food, lodging, and basic repair facilities. They were staffed by a small number of imperial servants and often overseen by local officials. These were not places of luxury, but of necessity. In between these stations, roads were patrolled, repaired, and maintained. Provincial governors were expected to keep their stretches of road in working order. Failure to do so could bring imperial disapproval or worse, funding cuts. Who used the cursus publicus? Despite its name, the cursus publicus was not open to the general public. It was reserved for official business: governors, military officials, tax collectors, and the occasional imperial messenger. To access it, one needed a diploma, a written authorization from the emperor or an appointed magistrate. These documents were not easily obtained. They were usually engraved on bronze or written on papyrus with official seals. Possessing one without proper authority could result in severe punishment. A senator might use the system to send reports from a distant province back to Rome. A military commander might dispatch news of a rebellion. A census taker might send tally records from Egypt to the capital. In some cases, imperial edicts were copied and sent to multiple provinces using different routes, ensuring that even if one courier failed, the message would still arrive. But the cursus publicus was also used for more mundane logistics, delivering tax receipts, transmitting population statistics, or coordinating grain shipments. This wasn't dramatic work, but it was essential. An empire of 60-70 million people could not function without paper, lists, and routes. The role of the tabularii. Messages didn't travel by magic, they were carried by tabularii or imperial couriers. These were often freedmen or slaves working under contract. They were not always literate, they didn't need to be, but they had to be reliable, discreet, and enduring. Couriers traveled light: satchels, documents, seals, and some form of identification. They learned to recognize routes not by maps, but by memorized waypoints. the sequence of stations, rivers, hill ranges. Some were trained in codes or substitution methods to obscure sensitive content. Tabularii faced dangers that rarely appear in the grand histories. Highway robbers, collapsed bridges, sudden weather changes, or hostile locals in poorly controlled provinces. Even their own fatigue could be an issue. Riding day after day on rough roads, sleeping in shared quarters, enduring the cold and heat, all for the empire's bureaucracy. And yet they kept moving. An imperial order delayed by even a day could result in missed taxes, mistimed troop movements, or administrative confusion. Quiet control. The cursus publicus was not about speed alone, it was about the projection of authority. Every mile of road marked Roman presence. Every milestone reinforced the empire's reach. Every sealed letter arriving in a governor's hand reminded him that Rome was watching. The system also created something unexpected: imperial time. For the first time, regions as distant as Hispania and Syria began to operate on a semi-synchronized rhythm. Provincial officials knew when messages might arrive. They could plan reports, taxes, and events accordingly. A kind of predictable administrative pulse began to beat across the empire. And this rhythm carried into daily life. Bakers, merchants, and farmers began to understand that certain times of year corresponded with imperial activities. Roads were busier during the census, quieter in winter. News from Rome came not all at once, but in a discernible pattern. The Roman road was not just a physical path, it was a corridor of expectation. Boring but binding. There's nothing particularly exciting about a man on a horse carrying a satchel of papers. There are no dramatic speeches, no battlefield clashes, just the steady shuffling of boots, the creak of cartwheels, the rustle of documents passed from one hand to another. And yet, this system held an empire together for centuries. When things failed, as they sometimes did during invasions, internal rebellions, or political collapse, the first signs were often disruptions to the cursus publicus. Couriers went missing. Roads were impassable. Communication lagged. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Chaos didn't come as a single event. It crept in, mile by mile, station by station. Which brings us to a simple, unresolved question. What happens to an empire when its messages stop arriving? It is now several years later. You are no longer seated at the edge of a road, but standing in the open courtyard of a mansio, listening to the metallic clatter of horseshoes being filed. The air smells of oiled leather and warm bread. A minor official sits at a wooden desk, unrolling a scroll. He is irritated. He's been waiting on a message that should have arrived yesterday. Somewhere along the cursus publicus, a delay has occurred. Not a catastrophic one, just enough to throw off schedules, postpone decisions, and stir bureaucratic uncertainty. It is in these small, forgotten moments that you begin to understand how fragile the system really was, and how deeply Rome relied on paper, timing, and the cooperation of its invisible administrators. A world built on paper. Rome's roads are well remembered, but its documents less so. And yet the Roman Empire produced staggering amounts of paperwork. Censuses, military reports, supply inventories, tax assessments, legal rulings, land surveys, postal authorizations. Much of it traveled via the cursus publicus, often on papyrus scrolls or, later, wooden tablets and parchment. At every stage, forms were duplicated. Couriers often carried copies, not originals, just in case something was lost. Messages were sealed with wax and stamped with official insignia. The condition of these seals, often more than the text itself, indicated whether a message had been tampered with. Some messages were simple. The governor of Gallia Narbonensis acknowledges receipt of the census rolls. Others were vast, multi-volume military reports detailing troop placements across the Danube frontier. These were tied with cords and protected by leather wrappings against rain and heat. Everything needed to be tracked. Each courier recorded their name, destination, time of departure, and identity of the issuing authority in travel registers. These records were copied and held at mutations and mansions along the route. In the event of disputes, delays, or misconduct, these logs could be consulted months later. It was a paper-bound system without email, without backup drives, and yet it worked. At least until it didn't. Bureaucracy and corruption. While the cursus publicus was efficient by ancient standards, it was also vulnerable to abuse. A system based on diplomata, travel authorizations, quickly attracted those seeking shortcuts. Provincial officials sometimes forged documents to move goods or messages more quickly. Others bribed station managers for access to horses and food. High-ranking senators sent family members on personal errands under the guise of imperial business. By the 3rd century CE, these abuses became so frequent that emperors issued edicts threatening penalties for misusing the vehiculatio. In one inscription found in Egypt, a local official was explicitly warned not to use imperial wagons to deliver gifts to friends in Alexandria. In Gaul, a governor complained that by the time imperial messages reached him, the news was already known by merchants who had bribed their way through the system more quickly. Even the couriers themselves sometimes failed in their duties. Inscriptions refer to missing riders, delayed reports, or damaged packages. Natural factors, mudslides, flooding, banditry were common excuses. Whether real or fabricated, they slowed the gears of government. And so, bit by bit, the administrators who ran the post roads began to add new layers of documentation. Check-in times, duplicate seals, notarized reports. These helped, until they didn't. Eventually, the paperwork began to exceed the pace of the message. Rome's roads in decline. The physical roads, those famed cobbled paths, were no less vulnerable to time. While some major arteries remained in good repair, especially near major cities, others began to suffer from neglect. Bridges collapsed and were never rebuilt. Drainage ditches filled with silt. Road markers wore smooth from centuries of wind and sand. Local governors, once responsible for road maintenance, had fewer funds as imperial coffers strained under military and political pressures. In the 3rd century CE, with Rome facing invasions and economic instability, infrastructure spending dropped significantly. One surviving report from a regional procurator in Gaul complained that the mutations under his jurisdiction had no feed for horses, that their roofs leaked, and that no messages had been delivered on time in months. Other stations disappeared altogether. Archaeological excavations in parts of North Africa have revealed mansions that were converted into farms or abandoned entirely by the late Roman period. Stone blocks from post stations were reused in villas or churches. What had once been a functioning network began to dissolve into local fragments. The slowing of the empire. As the cursus publicus faltered, so too did the administrative rhythm of the empire. Governors received orders too late. Troop movements became misaligned. Tax records went unprocessed. News of invasions reached Rome after cities had already fallen. The once predictable pulse of communication slowed, then stuttered. Even emperors began to notice. Diocletian, R. 284-305 CE, known for his sweeping administrative reforms, tried to revitalize the system. He reorganized provinces, issued new regulations on courier use, and reinforced major roads. He even built new roads like the famous Via Diagonalis in the Balkans. But these efforts were patchwork. By the 4th century, under Constantine and his successors, the cursus publicus was formally divided into multiple layers: fast couriers, cursus velox, and heavy wagons, cursus clabularis. But the system had become so complex that only the wealthiest provinces could maintain it. In other regions, governors began developing local alternatives. Some used private messengers. Others relied on church networks, which were growing in influence. The imperial post still existed on paper, but in many places, it no longer functioned in practice. The consequence wasn't immediate collapse, it was fragmentation. Each part of the empire began operating on its own time. Coordination eroded. Misinformation spread more easily. Delays were no longer an exception, but the norm. Echoes of decay. Even centuries later, long after the Western Roman Empire fell, traces of the cursus publicus remained. Pilgrims in the early medieval period sometimes followed old milestones when traveling to Rome. In Byzantine territory, remnants of Roman post roads were used by Eastern emperors to manage communications between Constantinople and frontier provinces. The Church adopted many of the Roman bureaucratic practices, sending letters sealed with insignia, maintaining registers, using relay stations at monasteries and shrines. But without a centralized state to maintain the full system, it became a shadow of its former scale. In Western Europe, it wasn't until Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century that anything resembling a postal system emerged again. Even then, it lacked the speed and geographic reach of the Roman model. Some milestones were never moved. You can still find them today, standing silently beside modern roads in Italy, France, and Spain. Most people pass by without notice, but those stones once counted distance in a system that unified millions. The quiet collapse. There is no single date when the cursus publicus ended. It didn't collapse in a single battle or decree. Instead, it faded. A letter delayed, a station unstaffed, a road washed away and never repaired, a courier who failed to arrive. This slow decay, so unremarkable at the time, was one of the clearest signs of empire unraveling, not in fire or blood, but in unread messages. So the question remains, when the road becomes uncertain and the message never comes, how long before people stop expecting it at all? The sun is setting now. You're standing on the crumbling edge of an ancient causeway, worn stones, grass breaking through the cracks, and a faint path carved by centuries of footsteps, hooves, and wheels. There is no longer a courier in sight. No stamped bronze diploma, no sealed scrolls or creaking wagons. Just the wind and the echo of what once moved through this space. But make no mistake, this road is not dead. The Roman post roads may no longer carry the imperial message, but they left something behind, an enduring structure beneath later empires, kings, and couriers. A boring infrastructure of stone and habit that, like the lines of a faded ledger, quietly structured the shape of the world to come. This is the afterlife of the cursus publicus. From imperial arteries to medieval footpaths. When the Western Roman Empire finally unraveled in the 5th century CE, the cursus publicus disintegrated unevenly. Some areas maintained parts of the system longer than others. In Gaul, for example, the Visigoths and Franks preserved some of the main roads for military or administrative uses. In Italy, Gothic rulers and later Byzantine governors attempted to revive communications, though never at the scale Rome had managed. Elsewhere, the roads simply remained as paths of least resistance. Merchants, travelers, and messengers used them not because they were Roman, but because they were still the best option. Villages often grew up around former mansions, which already had wells, ruins for stone recycling, and cleared land. Some of these became medieval towns. Others faded into farmsteads. The roads that once carried imperial orders now hosted ox carts of grain or barefoot pilgrims bound for holy shrines. The milestones, increasingly misunderstood, were sometimes treated as magical or sacred. In parts of rural Europe, local people repurposed them as boundary markers or churchyard pillars. Few remembered that they once told travelers how far they were from Rome. The church as a carrier of messages. In the absence of a centralized empire, The Catholic Church gradually inherited some of the Roman state's communication roles. Bishops communicated with Rome through their own courier networks, more fragile, but still effective. Monasteries maintained scriptoria, writing rooms, that copied and preserved old Roman administrative documents and road guides, such as the Itinerarium Antonini, a kind of Roman travel directory. The Church even adopted elements of the Roman postal hierarchy. Papal letters, papal bulls, were sealed and sent by trusted couriers, often monks or clergy. While these networks didn't rely on the old mutations, they did make use of surviving roads, those that were still passable. Pilgrimage routes followed these ancient lines. The Via Francigena, a route from Canterbury to Rome, passed along portions of older Roman roads. So did the routes to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. While the destinations had changed from mansions to monasteries, the idea remained: people moving with purpose, bearing messages or prayers. The post road, repurposed for salvation, rediscovery, and mapping in the Renaissance. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, scholars and rulers began to rediscover Rome's vast infrastructure, not through ruins alone, but through documentation. Ancient Roman road maps, such as the Tabula Peutingeriana, were studied and copied. Though distorted in form, it resembles a long scroll more than a geographically accurate map. The tabula contained stations and routes covering the entire empire. It was likely based on older itineraries used by cursus publicus officials. Early humanists and antiquarians in Italy began tracing these routes in the physical landscape. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as new states emerged and postal services were created under Habsburg, Bourbon, and papal authorities, the ancient Roman model became a reference point. Even the Latin phrase cursus publicus was revived in early bureaucratic writings, though often misunderstood. In this way, the ghost of the Roman post continued to shape how people thought about statehood and communication. A functioning government, it was believed, should have roads, couriers, and timetables. Roads, routes, and rationality. The idea that roads could organize an empire, that geography could shape governance, was one of Rome's most lasting contributions. It wasn't the stones alone, but the logic behind them. Regular spacing, predictable distances, systematic replacement of horses, central authorization. These concepts influenced early national postal systems in the early modern period. France's relais de poste, Prussia's ordre des postes, and even the British Royal Mail, established formally in 1516, reflected the administrative rationality that Rome had demonstrated. In these new systems, the language changed. Paper replaced scrolls. Coaches replaced single riders. But the heart of the system, the movement of messages by road through official relays, under state supervision, remained deeply Roman. It's a legacy that continued into the railway age and beyond. Even today, the idea of a postal code system organizing space through administrative zones echoes the logic of Roman provinces and their cursus stations. Archaeology and modern traces. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of mansions and mutations across former Roman territories. These structures are often simple, rectangular foundations, stone stables, hearths, and sometimes small baths. Inscriptions or reused milestones nearby often provide their identification. In Britain, for example, the route from Londinium, London, to Eboracum, York, follows what is now largely the A1 road. Along it, excavations have revealed rest stations like the one at Godmanchester, complete with grain storage and horse stalls. In North Africa, particularly along the Via Traiana Nova, connecting modern Jordan and Saudi Arabia, ruined road markers lie half buried in sand, some still legible. Travelers in the 19th century often mistook them for gravestones. In these stones, and in the silent foundations beneath vineyards and modern highways, the pattern of Roman communication still lingers waiting to be noticed. The dull glory of messages. There are no heroes in the cursus publicus, no decisive battles, no soaring speeches, just a courier, a horse, a road, and a message. And yet, it was these mundane elements that allowed emperors to govern from afar, armies to be supplied, and census counts to be recorded. In their boredom lies their brilliance. Rome did not control its empire by force alone, it did so through reliable information. A letter that arrived on time could prevent war. A tax report delivered in good order could fund a campaign. A law, copied and circulated, could stabilize an entire province. These were not dramatic acts, but they were powerful. And in the end, the fall of Rome was marked not just by barbarian invasions or corrupt emperors, but by the failure of these quiet, connective tissues. When the roads broke down and the couriers vanished, the empire's voice grew faint. Eventually, it was no longer heard at all. So the next time you pass an old stone road, or follow a winding rural path through Europe or North Africa, you might ask, what messages once passed this way urgent, forgotten, or never quite delivered? Story 3. Medieval farming calendars and the turning of the seasons. You awaken not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of a distant bell and the bleating of sheep. There is no watch on your wrist, no calendar on the wall, and yet you know what day it is not by number, but by what must be done. This is the medieval countryside. Time here is not measured in hours, but in labors, the chores that define the rhythm of life. Each month brings its duties, each season its anxieties. And while kings and knights often dominate history books, the true story of medieval Europe is written in plows, hayforks, and weather, watching a history so quiet and ordinary that it is almost always overlooked. Let us now turn to the farming calendars of the medieval world, documents so routine that most were never saved, yet so essential that every village functioned by their rhythm. Time before clocks. In much of early medieval Europe, particularly before the 14th century, clocks were rare. In rural areas, the idea of measuring time in equal hours would have seemed strange. What mattered was natural time: dawn, noon, dusk, the passing of the sun, the flowering of trees, the swell of rivers, the scent of damp soil in spring. The Julian calendar, introduced under Roman rule, was still in use, but few farmers ever saw a date written on parchment. Instead, they followed the labors of the months, a traditional sequence of tasks tied to natural phenomena. These labors were often depicted in illuminated manuscripts and church calendars: a figure sowing seeds for October, a man shearing sheep for June, a woman thrashing grain for August. Not art for art's sake, but memory guides. Farming was an act of remembering when to plant, when to weed, when to watch for frost. And unlike today's calendars, which fit weeks into neat rows, medieval calendars followed the church's feast days and the harvest cycle, both irregular, both sacred. January, rest and repair. The year began with darkness and mud. January was a time of inward tasks: mending tools, patching fences, repairing the thatch. In many regions, this was also the slaughtering season, meat preserved in salt or smoke for the months ahead. Manor records from 13th century England mention orders for large barrels of salt, used to cure pork and beef. The smell of brine was as much a sign of winter as snow. Grain stores were checked, pests warded off. Sometimes a farmer would walk miles to buy seeds for spring. Others bartered for tools or prayed at local chapels for mild weather. Time moved slowly. The land seemed asleep. February and March, the waiting season. In February, the sun began to return, but slowly. It was still too early to plow most fields. Wet soil would clump or rot the seeds. So instead, farmers turned manure into compost, moved stones from the earth, and trimmed vines or fruit trees. In March, fields were scored, lightly plowed to expose soil to sun and air. This was a delicate balance. Too early and the frost might kill the seed, too late and the crop would come in thin. By now, lambs were being born and calving had begun. These were critical weeks. A stillborn lamb or weak calf meant less meat, less wool, less wealth. This was also the time when prayers intensified. Fields were blessed. Rain was petitioned or delayed. Saints' feast days like St. Benedict's, March 21, became spiritual landmarks for planting decisions. And in all this, the calendar was less a tool and more a tradition spoken aloud, passed from parent to child. Never sow oats before the cuckoo sings, some said. Barley likes to drink but not to swim, said others. April and May, the true spring. With April came full plowing. Fields were broken open with wooden or iron-tipped plows. In most of Western Europe, these were pulled by oxen slower than horses, but better suited to heavy clay soils. Barley, oats, rye, and spring wheat were sown. Flax might be planted for linen. Hops in some regions were watched carefully, as their early growth could mean better brewing in autumn. May was for weeding backbreaking work done by hand or with simple tools. Fields were walked row by row. Wild mustard, thistle, and poppy were pulled before they could flower. In wealthier manors, children were sometimes paid a coin or two to scare birds from the young shoots. And amid all this there were bees. Hives were watched for signs of swarming. Honey, not sugar, was the main sweetener and wax was essential for candles. The calendar said nothing of this, but the bees had their own rhythm. They danced to it whether humans were ready or not. June and July, the mowing months. By June, the first hay was cut. This was the true turning point of the year. Winter feed for animals had to be stored, and the weather had to cooperate. A mistimed rain could ruin a haystack and lead to hunger in February. Mowers used long-handled scythes. Their rhythm was steady swing, step, starting at dawn and often continuing until midday. Women followed behind, raking and turning the grass. Children bundled it into cocks, small piles to dry. In July, sheep shearing occurred, another time-bound event. If done too early, the sheep might suffer from cold. Too late, and the wool would be matted or infested. Wool was the economic engine of medieval England, so careful shearing was essential. Monastic farms, such as those operated by Cistercian abbeys, maintained strict calendars for these tasks. Records show fines issued to workers who sheared carelessly or wasted wool. Through it all, the bell towers of churches provided the only universal time. Workers often marked the start and stop of labor by the bells for matins and vespers. Time in the farming year was both sacred and sweaty. August and September, harvest and risk. Harvest season was the climax of the year and the most dangerous. A poor harvest meant hunger. A storm at the wrong moment could flatten grain. Too much heat, and bread would be scarce by Lent. Entire villages turned out to work the fields. The sick, the old, even children joined in. Lords might bring in extra laborers from nearby towns. Harvest was a social contract. Help now, eat later. Wheat and rye were cut with sickles. Grain was threshed with flails winnowed by hand. Ovens were stoked. Millstones turned day and night. And still there were no written calendars in most homes. Only lived time, the angle of the sun, the tone of the soil, the whisper of the wind. All saying, now. Now is the moment. Now is the difference between enough and not enough. In September, fields were plowed again. Turnips and beans were planted. The next year had already begun months before winter. October, November, and December, the decline of light. October brought cold rains. Fields turned slick. Trees were stripped of fruit and wood gathered for fuel. In forested areas, pigs were let loose to forage for acorns, a practice called pannage. By November, flocks were moved to winter pasture. Cheese was stored in cellars. Larders were checked. December was marked not by agricultural labor but by religion. Advent began. Work slowed. The world turned dark. The calendar year was ending, but for the farmer, the agricultural year never truly ended. It curved into itself like a wheel. Each task, each prayer was both an end and a beginning. Calendars without numbers. What's most remarkable is that, for centuries, this vast, detailed agricultural system operated largely without dates. Instead, time was read in the flowering of elder trees, the migration of swallows, the day St. Martin's wine was ready November 11, the last frost that hardened the morning soil. These cues were more accurate than any parchment chart. They were stored not in libraries but in habits, in the dull repetition of generations, in the boring but essential details of life lived with the land. And so we are left with a quiet question. What happens to a people when they no longer feel the rhythm of the earth beneath their feet? You are still in the fields. But now you are not alone. You hear distant voices, neighbors exchanging brief greetings, monks chanting beyond a distant hedge, and the bark of a dog keeping sheep in line. All around you there is movement, not in haste, but in ritual. Each action is part of a larger pattern, one that repeats not just seasonally, but socially. Farming in medieval Europe was never a solitary affair. It was communal, negotiated, hierarchical, and deeply interwoven with the rhythms of religion and custom. To understand the calendar fully, we must now look beyond the soil and into the social structures that defined how land was used, who worked it, and how even the most mundane tasks like mending a fence or gathering firewood reflected centuries of inherited obligation. The village as a living clock. In medieval Europe, particularly in the Carolingian and post-Carolingian West, most peasants lived in open-field villages. These settlements were not random clusters of cottages, but organized landscapes shaped over generations. Fields were divided into long, narrow strips, allocated to families according to local custom. These strips weren't fenced but were rotated and reallocated seasonally or annually. Most villagers farmed several scattered strips not for fairness, but for risk mitigation. If one strip failed, others might still succeed. Time in the village was shared, too. Plowing was coordinated so that no strip was disrupted. Sowing was done together, using communal oxen teams. Harvesting required collective effort. Even manuring was often scheduled. Local reeves or bailiffs, usually reporting to the lord or manor steward, would call meetings to agree on the start of a task. Church bells might announce the opening of the fields in spring. The farming calendar wasn't just tied to the weather, it was tied to agreement. And when disputes arose, say, someone sowed too early or grazed animals too long, village courts would convene to resolve them. These weren't high courts of law, but local, customary tribunals. Their records, where they survive, offer glimpses of daily life. Fines for late planting, complaints about fence repair, judgments over borrowed oxen. Time was a shared resource, and so were its errors. The role of the church in the farming year. Religion marked the rhythm of rural life just as much as weather. Every village centered around a parish church, and its calendar drawn from saints. Feast days and liturgical seasons overlapped with agricultural labor. Candlemas, Feb 2, time to begin pruning vines or cleaning tools. Rogation days, late spring, fields were walked and blessed to protect the harvest. Lammas, Aug 1, loaves of new wheat were offered in thanks. Michaelmas, Sept 29, marked the end of the agricultural accounting year. The church didn't just dictate holy days, it also governed time off. On saints, days and Sundays, work was to be avoided, at least in theory. A 13th century English laborer might have 50-60 such rest days per year, far more than a modern factory worker. But these were not always restful. Many involved long services, fasts, or extra chores related to church upkeep. The local priest often acted as timekeeper, reading the Gospels and announcing the feast days ahead. He might also record tithes, managed the parish tithe barn, where a portion of every harvest was stored for the church, and settled disputes between villagers about planting times or grazing access. In some places, especially in monastic lands, monks dictated the rhythm of labor directly. Monasteries ran massive estates, and their calendars copied meticulously in scriptoria detailed the seasonal obligations of their workers: when to dig ditches, prune orchards, or gather reeds. These documents, often dry and formulaic, are a treasure trove of seasonal data. The boring details entries like, on the feast of St. Cuthbert, the peasants shall deliver 6 bundles of thatch to the granary, preserve a lived timeline more accurate than any clock. Livestock and the moving calendar. The agricultural calendar wasn't just about crops, it was also deeply concerned with animals, which required different kinds of seasonal planning. Spring, lambing, calving, and preparation for pasture. Summer, herding, milking, cheese-making, and shearing. Autumn, pannage in forests, livestock sales and culling before winter. Winter, indoor feeding, stable maintenance, and animal doctoring. Each animal had its own timeline. Chickens began laying more eggs as the days lengthened. Pigs fattened best in autumn on fallen acorns. Cattle could be milked through most of the year, but yields dropped in the cold. Calendars reflected this in simple notes: watch the ewes in March, salt the pork by St. Andrew's Day. But behind these lines lay entire systems of care, breeding, slaughter, and trade. Even dung had its timing. Manure had to be collected, rotted, and spread at the right moments. Some monasteries kept precise records of when manure carts left each field. A late application could ruin next year's barley. This was not glamorous labor, but it mattered. Tools, taxes, and tenure. The medieval farming calendar also included duties beyond planting and harvesting. Much of rural Europe operated under feudal tenure. Peasants called serfs, villeins, or cotters, depending on status, owed labor or payments to their lords. These duties were often seasonal. Spring, repairing ditches, clearing roads, working the lord's domain land. Summer, extra hands for haymaking or harvest. Autumn, transporting grain or grapes to market. Winter, carting firewood, repairing buildings. These obligations were recorded in manorial rolls, which were updated each year, usually at Michaelmas. A peasant might owe 3 days of plowing in May, 1 day of hedge cutting in July, and a payment of hens in December. The calendar was not merely about survival, it was also about compliance. Failure to meet these expectations could result in fines, recorded meticulously by manorial clerks. These fines were not punitive in the modern sense, they were reminders of the seasonal contract that governed rural life. Agricultural technology and its timing. While medieval farming is often seen as stagnant, it was in fact incrementally innovative, and these changes were tightly tied to the calendar. The introduction of the 3-field system, rotating crops between autumn-sown grain, spring-sown grain, and fallow, allowed for more efficient planning. The heavy plow, with a vertical iron share and mold board, revolutionized farming in northern Europe's wet soils, but required coordinated ox teams and careful soil drying times. Windmills and watermills replaced hand querns, increasing flour production, but also shifting the grinding period closer to harvest time. These weren't sudden revolutions. They were gradual additions layered into the seasonal rhythm over decades. A mill might take 10 years to build. A new plow might require a village-wide adjustment in task scheduling. Time, again, was measured not in years, but in tasks successfully integrated. Negotiated time. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the medieval agricultural calendar is how negotiated it was. Time was never fixed. It was flexible, discussed, and above all local. 2 villages only a few miles apart might plant at different times. One might begin haymaking in early June, the other in mid-July. The reason? soil conditions, water availability, customs, memories of a bad harvest 20 years ago, all shaped decisions. And these negotiations weren't always peaceful. Some villages fought over grazing rights. Others sued one another over stream access or planting dates. Priests occasionally mediated these disputes. Lords imposed fines or set rules. But most of the time, villagers settled it themselves through habit, precedent, and quiet compromise. Time then was not only a natural rhythm, it was a social contract, renegotiated each season. So now we ask, in a world governed by watches and digital alerts, what might we learn from a time system built on hay, sheep, and neighborly agreement? You wake to silence. The birds are late, the wind is still, and the ground, once rich with dew, is dry and cracked. Something is off. The oats are thin, the wheat stunted. The rhythm of the farming year, the comfort of known labors and predictable yields has been disrupted. For all the ritual, care, and shared knowledge, the medieval agricultural calendar was fragile. It functioned only under a delicate balance of sun, rain, muscle, and memory. And when that balance tipped, it didn't simply inconvenience a few, it endangered whole communities. In this final section, we look at what happened when the calendar failed, when the weather betrayed expectations, when food stores emptied too early, and when nature moved to its own erratic beat. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, a calendar broken. From 1315 to 1317, Western Europe experienced one of its most devastating food crises, the Great Famine. It began with rain. In the spring of 1315, weeks of near-constant rainfall delayed the sowing season across much of France, England, and the Low Countries. Fields became unworkable. Oxen sank into mud. When grain was finally planted, it rotted. The cold, damp weather persisted into summer, and the next spring brought more of the same. Farmers who had relied on centuries of seasonal rhythm suddenly faced unreadable cues. The clouds were no longer messengers of relief, but harbingers of confusion. The harvests failed, and then in 1316 they failed again. This wasn't just a bad year, it was a collapse of the calendar. The consequences were staggering. Grain prices doubled and then tripled, leading to riots in towns and hunger in villages. Seed stocks were eaten in desperation, leaving nothing for the next planting. Livestock diseases spread in the wet, unsanitary conditions, reducing access to meat and milk. Social order strained. Petty theft, grain hoarding, and even accusations of sorcery emerged as communities searched for scapegoats. Chroniclers wrote of people eating roots, bark, and worse. Some contemporary accounts even mention cannibalism, though modern historians debate how widespread this may have been. Most significantly, the famine revealed how deeply intertwined agriculture, trust, and time had become. Without the calendar, people lost not just crops but direction. Folklore and weather lore, coping with the unpredictable. Faced with this uncertainty, peasants turned to what they could control. Stories, omens, and sayings, oral wisdom that added texture to the calendar. Some were rooted in observation. If since Swithin's day be dry, the next 40 will pass by. When the oak comes before the ash, we shall have a splash. When the ash before the oak, we shall have a soak. Others mixed faith with fear. A late frost on May 1113, the days of the ice saints, was seen as a divine test. Red skis at night promised fair weather. Red skis at morning warned of storms. These sayings weren't superstition, they were tools, used to recalibrate the calendar when experience failed. If the usual signs failed to appear, no frogs croaking, no bees swarming, people adjusted their plans. In a world without climate forecasts, folklore became seasonal insurance. Memory and misfortune, the role of oral history. Another tool for surviving the fragility of the calendar was intergenerational memory. Old people were revered not only for wisdom but for experience. A grandmother might remember a frost that came late in her youth. A father might recall the dry summer of the year the river ran shallow. These memories, passed in story or song, created a mental archive of agricultural outliers. They became a living record offering guidance not for the average year, but for the exceptions. Some of these became embedded in communal rituals. After a failed harvest, villages might conduct rogation processions walking the boundaries of fields, chanting prayers, and asking for divine favor. These processions also reminded people of field rites and local landmarks, reinforcing both social and spatial memory. The calendar, once again, was not just dates, it was relationships, knowledge, and community resilience. Coping mechanisms: storage, diversification, and migration. Medieval farmers weren't passive victims of the elements. They developed strategies to absorb shocks. Granaries and pit storage. Grain was stored in underground pits or wooden bins, carefully sealed against rodents and moisture. While not perfect, these could preserve food across years if managed well. Crop diversification. A household might grow wheat, barley, rye, and oats not because of culinary preference but as risk hedging. Oats survived better in wet soil. Barley grew quickly. Some years one failed while the others endured. Livestock as savings. Animals were mobile calories. A goat could be sold or slaughtered in a crisis. Pigs, fed on food scraps, provided fat and meat during shortages. Seasonal migration. In some regions, laborers traveled to wealthier areas during lean seasons. Young men might walk 50-100 miles to find work during harvests, sending food or coin back home. This agricultural migration was rarely recorded but deeply embedded in the rural economy. Communal grain banks. Some monasteries and manorial estates kept emergency reserves to be lent out in hard times. These systems, though imperfect, sometimes reduced the scale of famine. Still, none of these measures were foolproof. When the rhythm of the year broke completely, when planting was late, grazing failed, and disease struck, the system teetered. The calendar's long shadow. After the Great Famine, and again after the Black Death in 1347-1351, the medieval farming calendar shifted. Labor shortages led to higher wages for peasants. Lords reduced their domain holdings and leased land instead. Farming became slightly more commercial, driven by markets, not just survival. Yet the calendar remained. Even as more people moved to towns, even as printed almanacs began to appear, the bones of the seasonal cycle remained visible. Villages still opened their fields together. Saints' days still guided planting decisions. Sayings about frost, harvest moons, and bad weather endured. And perhaps most importantly, the agricultural calendar continued to remind people of their dependence on forces beyond their control. The calendar didn't just teach people when to sow, it taught them to wait, to endure, to cooperate, and to hope that the earth, though fickle, would provide again. Boring, fragile, and vital. It is easy to overlook the farming calendar, easy to see it as quaint or irrelevant. But for over 1,000 years, it was the most important document never written down. It held no dramatic events, no dates of battles, no declarations or royal decrees. And yet, it recorded something far more universal: the fragile partnership between people and the land. So, when the wind failed to shift on time, or the bees refused to swarm, or the snow came a week too early, this wasn't merely inconvenient. It was terrifying, because it meant the rhythm had faltered. And when the rhythm falters, how do you find your place in the year? Story 4. 1,000-year contract, the lease of Holy Roman forest land. You are deep in the woods. Not the wild, tangled wilderness of myth, but a managed forest, a living document marked by boundaries, rights, and agreements. The trees around you aren't random. They have histories, ownership, and purposes. And somewhere in a vaulted stone room far from here, there is a piece of parchment that determines who may hunt here, who may cut timber, and who may simply pass. This is not a story of war, of kings, or of rebellion. It is the story of a lease, a contract between a small community and an imperial authority, written in careful Latin, sealed with wax, and designed to last 1,000 years. And though it may sound like fiction, this kind of lease truly existed. In the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000-year forest leases were real, and in some cases they were honored until modern times. The medieval forest, not wilderness but resource. When we picture the forests of medieval Europe, we often imagine them as untamed spaces, dense, lawless, home to outlaws and wolves. But the truth is far more intricate. Forests in the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in the Germanic territories, were structured spaces. They were not merely land, they were economic systems. Timber for building and firewood. Foraging for nuts, berries, and mushrooms. Pasture for pigs, called mast feeding or pannage. Hunting grounds reserved for elites. Turf cutting, resin collection, beehives, and charcoal burning. Each activity had rules. Each right had an owner, and these rights were leased, inherited, or traded. Forests were not owned. In a modern sense, they were entitled in parts. One person might hold grazing rights, another the right to collect fallen branches. A third might hold the Recht zur Rodung, the right to clear land for farming. And because rights could be distributed across centuries and dozens of people, documentation was essential. Enter the 1,000-year lease. The origin of a 1,000-year lease. One of the most cited examples of such a lease is the Schwäbisch Hall Forest Contract, a 1,000-year lease granted by an abbot or noble family to a group of villagers. Others existed in the Black Forest, in Bavaria, and in the regions near modern Austria and Switzerland. These contracts weren't casual agreements. They were written by notaries trained in canon and imperial law, copied in triplicate and sealed. Typical features included the duration, sometimes 99 years, sometimes in perpetuity, and in rare cases, explicitly 1,000 years. The conditions, payment in kind, wood, grain, or labor, limited access to hunting or cutting, and responsibilities for fire management or trail maintenance. The parties, often between a monastery or noble family and a village commune or collective. The forfeiture clause. If the tenant failed to meet obligations for multiple years, the lease could be revoked. In essence, these were legal operating systems for rural life. They weren't just about land, they encoded relationships between people, trees, and time. How these contracts functioned day to day. Let's imagine a small alpine village in the year 1342. The village holds a 1,000-year lease on a nearby forest, granted by the Benedictine monastery that owns much of the surrounding land. The lease allows collection of deadwood for winter fuel, grazing of pigs from September through November, limited timber for house repairs, no felling of large oaks or pines without permission, gathering of mushrooms, herbs, and berries for personal, not commercial use. In return, the villagers must deliver a cartload of cut logs each year to the monastery, maintain the forest road used by the monks, provide 3 days of labor annually in clearing underbrush to reduce fire risk. Each year, these duties are discussed at a village meeting. If someone violates the agreement, cutting more trees than permitted, say the matter is recorded in the village's copy of the lease and reported. Once a decade, the monks send an inspector to assess compliance. Any disputes are mediated by customary law, often before a local magistrate or through ecclesiastical courts. This system might sound tedious, but it worked. It provided continuity, stability, and a framework for managing resources collectively. Why 1,000 years? You might wonder, why such a long duration? Why not 99 years or a renewable century? The answer lies in symbolism. In medieval Europe, especially within the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years was more theological than practical. The number echoed biblical references, the millennium of peace mentioned in Revelation. It implied divine sanction, eternal stability, and trust in future generations. In practice, no one truly expected the terms of the lease to remain identical for a millennium. But by writing it down, the parties ensured that the intent, shared use, mutual benefit, and forest stewardship would outlast any individual. These contracts often included language such as, "This right shall be held by their sons and their sons' sons, even unto the 10th generation, and may not be revoked unless by God's judgment or universal agreement." This was not mere poetry, it was legal thinking, continuity as law. And in a society without mass literacy, the very existence of a document stamped, sealed, and recited aloud was power. The role of monasteries and nobles. Most of these long-term leases were granted by monasteries, bishoprics, or noble families' landowners who had both territorial control and clerical access. Monasteries often sought to encourage sustainable use of their forests. A 1,000-year lease bound villagers to mutual stewardship, protecting the land from overuse while providing for local needs. Nobles, especially minor lords or abbots, used leases to maintain authority while outsourcing management. In return, the monastery received goods and services, often more valuable over time than simple rents. These leases were typically written in Latin, sometimes with a local vernacular translation added for village use. Copies were stored in monastic archives, while villages maintained their own parchment, or, in some cases, wooden tally sticks marked with symbols denoting rights. The slow bureaucracy of these arrangements, so easy to overlook, held rural economies together. They prevented arbitrary rule. They offered protection to peasants. They reflected the practical application of law in a world without formal courts for every dispute. The long-term view. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about these leases is that some of them lasted. In the region of Upper Swabia, one lease, signed in the 12th century, was formally renewed in the 18th century over 600 years later. The monastery still received its annual cartload of logs. The villagers still debated who was responsible for clearing fallen limbs from a shared trail. Even under Napoleonic reforms, some of these contracts were recognized, grandfathered into new legal systems, or compensated when territories changed hands. The boring, unglamorous persistence of a forest lease tells us something fundamental. That medieval people, often painted as short-sighted or irrational, were capable of thinking in centuries. They did not always assume the future would be better, but they assumed it would come, and they wrote their agreements to endure it. So now, in the shadow of those trees and the echo of that 1,000-year promise, you might wonder, what kinds of contracts are we writing today that we expect to last 1,000 years? The contract has been signed. The wax seal has cooled. The villagers return to their daily lives, herding pigs, collecting brush, and splitting logs for winter. But even now, the forest lease is only beginning its life. Because what happens next is not dramatic but crucial. It is enforced slowly, collectively, and through generations. The real history of the 1,000-year lease lies not in its creation, but in how people lived with it. This section explores how a legal document came to shape centuries of quiet negotiation between forests, families, and faith, and how trees, so often silent in our histories, were carefully watched, counted, and claimed. A living document. Though written in ink on parchment, the lease was never static. It had to adapt to time not by rewriting, but through interpretation. The villagers who held the lease knew what it allowed them to do: gather deadwood, graze pigs, take limited timber. But what counted as deadwood? Could a storm-felled tree be cut up and hauled home, or did it belong to the monastery? If two families claimed the same stump, who decided? The original lease often said little about such specifics. Instead, the answers emerged from custom, shaped by decades of use and discussion. Village elders remembered precedents. Church officials clarified intent. Local scribes recorded disputes. The result was a sort of layered law in which the letter of the contract remained constant, but its meaning grew with use. One early decision that beekeeping hives were allowed in the southern grove might lead, a century later, to a small industry. Another dispute over acorn rights might end in a locally respected rule: no pig grazing before Michaelmas unless the mast is heavy. The thousand-year lease, in this way, was not just a piece of paper. It was a cultural agreement, co-created by generations who worked under its terms. Inheritance and stewardship. The lease passed down through inheritance, not always by blood, but by membership in the village commune or community. Sometimes, families would divide rights among sons. In other cases, the forest use rights stayed with the village collectively, while individuals rotated responsibilities. This inheritance required memory and trust. Without written land registries or cadastral surveys, people relied on oral boundaries. From the crooked beach to the standing stone. The north side of the Black Creek, but not past the Fox Mound, where the sun strikes first in early spring. These weren't vague, they were precise to those who knew the land. The forest was not just a place, it was a social document. But inheritance could also bring tension. What happened when someone moved away and returned years later, claiming their family's right to collect timber? Or when a widow remarried and her children disputed who now held rights to graze goats in the upper slope? These questions often reached the village court, a body composed of elders, sometimes with a priest or representative from the Lord. They didn't always have clear answers, but they had tradition and, perhaps more importantly, a shared need to keep the system working. Too much conflict, and the Lord might revoke the lease. Too little order, and the forest might be stripped bare. The forest as governance. Because of these leases, the forest became a space of local governance, not imposed from above but enacted through routine. Villagers appointed woodward's guardians who monitored tree felling and fined those who cut illegally. They created rotational schedule for grazing to prevent overuse. They designated certain groves for seasonal use only, and others as sacred or off-limits, whether for ecological, religious, or simply practical reasons. Even firewood was regulated. In many leases, only windfall or hooked branch firewood could be collected, meaning that one could take branches that had fallen or could be cut without harming the tree. Felling entire trunks required explicit permission, sometimes only granted every 7 or 10 years. These practices created a subtle but effective form of environmental management, not out of modern conservation ideals, but out of survival and long-term thinking. The forest, as governed by the thousand-year lease, was not a wilderness to be conquered. It was a partner in negotiation. Conflict and arbitration. Inevitably, disputes arose. One village might accuse another of cutting too deeply into a shared forest. A monk might find his annual tithe of firewood underweight. A woodcutter might be caught felling green trees under cover of fog. In these cases, the lease became a reference point but never a final answer. It was interpreted by judges, bishops, or imperial officials, depending on the gravity of the case. In the 15th century, a dispute between two Bavarian villages over beach coppice rights reached the Reichskammergericht, the imperial chamber court. The case referenced a 12th century lease still preserved in a monastery archive. Though faded, it outlined the right of coppicing every 3rd year, to a depth no greater than one man's reach from the cart path. Such phrases vague in writing were clarified by custom. Witnesses testified. Elders spoke of long-dead fathers who had once worked the same grove. The verdict, eventually, upheld the lease, but only after 20 years of hearings. This slowness may seem inefficient, but it also reveals a deep truth. The system was designed to endure disagreement without collapse. Rather than tear up the lease, people bent around it. External threats to the system. Over time, outside forces challenged the stability of these ancient agreements. Feudal fragmentation. As the Holy Roman Empire decentralized, overlapping claims to land and rights became more common. A forest might fall under a monastery's domain, but also within the jurisdiction of a princely bishop. This created confusion over who had authority to enforce the lease or revoke it. War and occupation. During times of conflict like the 30 Years' War 1618–1648, forest leases were often ignored or violated. Armies stripped woods for timber. Villagers fled or were conscripted. Archives were burned. Some leases disappeared entirely, not because they were broken, but because no one was left to remember them. Economic chain. By the 18th century, the rise of market economies put pressure on traditional systems. Timber became a commodity, not a subsistence resource. Wealthy merchants sought to purchase forest tracts outright. Noble families sold off rights once leased for communal use. Even so, some leases survived these pressures, updated, reaffirmed, or simply tolerated. In rare cases, imperial authorities in Vienna or local princes reissued charters, citing the original lease as precedent. The parchment endured, so did the memory. Lessons from a 1,000-year lease. At its heart, the lease tells us something important about how medieval people viewed time. They knew change would come. They knew trees would fall, people would die, villages might shrink or grow, but they believed in continuity through custom. The forest lease was a living promise, a commitment not to a rigid rule, but to a shared relationship. It acknowledged that the land outlived individuals, and that law, if practiced patiently, could serve both present and future. No one who signed such a lease ever saw its end, but they signed it anyway. So now, centuries later, as we stand among the whispering beaches and moss-covered boundary stones, we might ask, what agreements do we make today that honor generations will never meet? The trees have grown taller, the ink has faded, the village has changed names twice, yet the contract still exists. Perhaps it is locked in an archive under glass, or copied into a modern registry by a cautious clerk. Perhaps it is invoked once a year at a community gathering where logs are still delivered, symbolically, to a town hall that no longer has a firewood shortage. Or perhaps it has finally lapsed, its last witnesses gone, but the trail it carved through time remains visible in boundaries, traditions, and quiet customs. This final chapter of the story is not about the making or managing of the lease, but its legacy, how a 1,000-year document echoes even when its legal power has faded. How memory, law, and land became braided into the long arc of European rural history. The lease in the modern age. By the 19th century, the political landscape of Central Europe had changed dramatically. The Holy Roman Empire was gone, replaced by rising nation-states, Napoleonic civil codes, and centralized bureaucracies. The parchment contracts of medieval forests seemed, to many, like artifacts of a lost world. Yet many of these leases persisted not because they were enforced by police or court, but because they had become part of the landscape itself. Take the case of the Krottenhof lease in Upper Bavaria. Originally signed in the early 12th century, it granted a local community long-term grazing and firewood rights in exchange for cartloads of pine delivered annually to a monastery. When Napoleon's armies secularized church property in the early 1800s, legal reformers were unsure what to do with these leases. They could not simply cancel them. There was no legal mechanism for erasing centuries-old customary rights. So they recorded them, in ledgers, in cadastral maps, in notarial transcriptions. They changed the format but not the content. Some leases even gained new life. In the 19th century, local German and Austrian authorities began codifying ancient forest rights as part of their emerging property laws. What began as oral custom and hand-copied parchment entered typed legal codes and municipal books. The lease, once symbolic and slow, had become institutionalized. When trees have memory. In some communities, the forest itself remembered. Boundary trees were blazed marked with signs to denote ownership, like crosses or initials. Boulders or carved wooden posts served as permanent landmarks mentioned in the lease text, from the stone of the Three Lords to the twin firs of the Eastern Path. Groves were named after the purpose they served: Beehive Hollow, Coalburner's Rise, the Swine Path. Even if the text of the lease was lost or unreadable, the forest continued to structure behavior. Villagers knew which glade allowed for berry picking and which slope was restricted during calving season. They knew which trails belonged to whom, even if the original Latin clauses were no longer quoted. One German forester in the early 20th century noted that a village in the Black Forest still observed a complex rotation of wood gathering that dated to a monastic agreement from the 1300s, an agreement no one in the village had read in over a century. This wasn't mere nostalgia. It was living legal memory passed down through habit, not parchment. Conflict in the modern era. The endurance of ancient leases was not always peaceful. As industrialization spread in the 19th and 20th centuries, the value of forest resources rose sharply. Timber became a global commodity. Commercial hunting rights became profitable. Roads and railways needed wood. The ancient logic of limited, communal use came into tension with capitalist ownership models. In several documented cases, large estates tried to buy out or annul old village leases. Governments attempted to centralize forest management, clashing with customary rights. Villagers took disputes to court, producing centuries-old leases as evidence of continued use. Some cases dragged on for years. In one case from Lower Austria in 1922, villagers from 5 hamlets sued the Regional Forest Administration for access to beechwood stands granted under a 14th-century lease. They presented copies of the original contract, tax records from the 1600s, and testimonies from elders. The case was decided in their favor. Even in the 20th century, medieval contracts still had force. But more often, it was not about law but about community identity. The lease wasn't just a right, it was a story, a proof that their ancestors had mattered, that they belonged to the land and it to them. Ceremonial continuity. In many towns, long-expired leases were honored through ritual, not enforcement. Once a year, perhaps on the feast of St. Hubert, patron of foresters, villagers would march into the woods, fell a symbolic tree, deliver a log to the former monastery, now a school or civic building, hold a modest meal or procession. No one believed the lease still governed behavior, but the act of reenactment carried meaning. It remembered an agreement across centuries. It acknowledged that even boring, bureaucratic history could form the spine of belonging. In Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, such traditions continue in pockets now supported by local heritage societies or folkloric associations. These rituals may feel quaint, but they are also a living negotiation with the past. Lessons from a lease. At first glance, a 1,000-year forest lease seems too dull to matter. It has no military campaigns, no royal intrigues, no great inventions. It is a document about trees, pigs, and firewood. It is about who can collect resin and when, about how many days of labor must be provided to repair a road. And yet this lease contains profound truths. That continuity matters, that trust between generations can be written. That memory is infrastructure, A forest becomes law when people agree to treat it that way. That legal rights can grow slowly like oaks, shaped by wind and weather and time. That stewardship is often boring, but it is how civilizations endure. The lease asks for care, not urgency, not revolution, just care over time. The silence of the forest. Today, many of the forests once governed by such leases still exist. Some have changed hands. Others have been absorbed into public parks or conservation areas. The contracts are mostly kept in archives if they survive at all. But the trails remain. The boundary stones stand. The hills still echo with birdsong. And the idea that people might make agreements meant to outlast themselves remains quietly radical. So, as you imagine the cool hush beneath the canopy, and the centuries of footsteps that passed before you, one final question lingers. If you were to sign a contract today, what would you promise to protect for the next 1,000 years? Story 5. The Salt Roads of the Sahara. You are not surrounded by ocean, forest, or river. You are in the desert. Flat, vast, and shimmering with heat, the Sahara stretches to every horizon, empty to the casual eye, but rich with movement if you know where to look. The footsteps of men and the groan of camels leave no permanent mark, yet they trace a path that has existed for centuries. This is not a caravan of treasure. No gold, no silk, no ivory. This is a caravan of salt. Heavy, dull, essential salt was once so valuable in West Africa that it was measured against gold by weight. And to bring it from the salt pans of the Sahara to the river cities of Mali, Niger, and beyond required one of history's most overlooked logistical feats, the trans-Saharan salt trade. Not romantic, not glamorous, but utterly necessary. This is the story of how salt moved across the Sahara, slowly, predictably, in silence. The value of salt. Today, salt is everywhere, on every table, in every grocery aisle. But in much of the pre-modern world, salt was survival. It preserved food before refrigeration. It supplemented diets in tropical regions, where sweating depleted the body. It enabled long-distance trade in meat, dairy, and fish. It was critical for animal husbandry. It was even used in rituals and taxation. In West Africa, especially between the 7th and 16th centuries, salt was both commodity and currency. In some parts of the Sahel, one slab of salt could buy several goats. In others, salt blocks were carved down into coin-sized pieces to use in market transactions. But this salt had to come from somewhere. The most important sources lay deep in the central Sahara at places like Tagheza and Taoudeni in modern-day Mali. These settlements had no fresh water, no trees, and barely any soil. Yet they produced thousands of tons of salt annually, extracted by hand, cut into slabs, and loaded onto camel caravans bound for markets hundreds of miles to the south. Camels, the silent engines of the desert. The salt trade would not have existed without the camel specifically. The dromedary, or one-humped camel, introduced to the Sahara from Arabia sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE. With its wide, padded feet, tolerance for heat, and ability to go over a week without water, the camel became the core technology of Saharan transport. Each camel could carry between 200 and 300 kilograms of salt, about 5 to 8 large slabs. Caravans often consisted of hundreds or even thousands of camels, led by seasoned desert guides called azalai. Their progress was slow, 25-30 kilometers per day. Navigation was done by stars, wind patterns, and landmarks, rock formations, ancient wells, or the bleached bones of earlier travelers. Water was rationed carefully, so was food. Salt weighed heavily and the camels groaned with effort, but they moved day after day with a patience that came to define the trade. This was not a luxury journey, it was logistics at its purest. Tagheza, the salt town of no water. One of the most remarkable places on the salt roads was Tagheza, located in the middle of nowhere, yet once a hub of high value. By the 14th century, Tagheza was described by Arab geographers as a city built of salt blocks, its houses, mosques, and walls all constructed from large slabs of the very product it exported. The buildings melted slowly in the rare desert rains. No one lived in Tagheza permanently. Its population consisted almost entirely of slaves and hired laborers brought in to extract salt from shallow pits. There was no vegetation, no arable land. Water had to be carried in hundreds of kilometers from oases to the south. Work was grueling. Men dug in heat that could reach 50 degrees C, 122 degrees F, using picks and shovels to extract crystalline blocks from the earth. The salt was then cut into rectangular slabs, typically around 100 pounds, 45 kg each. These were stacked, bound, and stored for caravans. When ready, the camels would arrive, be loaded, and begin the long trek south. Tagheza was a ghost town in every sense, but a productive one. In the 16th century, Moroccan Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur sent an army across the desert to seize control of Tagheza's salt mines. It was not for glory, it was for revenue. The journey south. The route from Tagheza or Taoudeni to Timbuktu or Gao-Ki, commercial cities in Mali, was more than 500 miles through shifting sands, scorching days, and frigid nights. Caravans moved in the coolest hours, often traveling at night. Camps were set up in tight, strategic formations to protect against bandits or sandstorms. There were no inns, no roads, only the vast, pale ocean of sand. Guides were essential. A single wrong turn could add days, deplete water supplies, or strand the caravan. Some desert guides memorized dozens of routes, each optimal for a different season, wind direction, or political condition. Along the way, caravans stopped at oases like Aryayuane or in Sala, small points of relief, where traders could water camels, rest, and exchange small goods. But even these were transient. The desert was always moving, always swallowing. Still, the system worked. For centuries, salt moved from north to south, while gold, ivory, cola nuts, and slaves moved south to north. These weren't dramatic journeys. They were monotony with purpose. Every footstep in the sand marked the flow of capital, survival, and empire. Timbuktu, the salt market of the Sahel. Upon arrival in the river cities, especially Timbuktu, salt became currency. Timbuktu was no sleepy town. By the 15th century, it was a center of Islamic scholarship, home to libraries, mosques, and universities. But beneath that intellectual culture was an infrastructure of trade, supported by the salt roads. Salt was offloaded in large slabs, stacked for sale in market stalls or under shaded awnings. Traders from the forest zones to the south came to barter or buy. Price was determined by quality, weight, and condition. Salt that had cracked or splintered fetched less. In some cases, salt was even re-exported, carried farther south into territories where it was rarer still. Records from Timbuktu show entire contracts written on salt transactions. Slaves were bought in salt. Legal fines were paid in salt. Taxes could be rendered in salt. It was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. A trade measured in generations. It's easy to imagine the salt trade as a single event, but for the men and camels who walked it, it was a lifetime. A trader might begin his career at 14, walking with his uncle's caravan. By 40, he might lead his own. By 60, he had memorized every oasis, every storm sign, every night sky. No monuments marked their names. No epics were written about their journeys, yet their steps built empires. The Ghana Empire, not modern Ghana, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire all drew power from this trade. Salt funded armies, scholars, mosques, and markets. Without it, food spoiled, diets failed, economies collapsed. And so the caravans continued. Even today, in parts of Mali and Mauritania, small salt caravans still operate carrying slabs by camel across shrinking dunes. The trade is no longer central, but its pattern remains like a well-worn groove in a much older song. So now, as the sun sets on a sand-colored horizon, and the camels kneel for rest, one quiet question lingers. In a world obsessed with speed, what have we lost by forgetting how to move slowly but deliberately? You return to the desert. The sun has risen again, and so have the caravans. Hooves crunch into salt crust, sand lifts in swirls. Somewhere far behind, a camel groans. You are not witnessing a grand battle or a royal decree. You are watching trade, quiet, deliberate, necessary. In this second part of the story, we shift focus from the physical journey of salt to the structures it supported. Behind every slab carried across the Sahara was an empire, a political arrangement, a city, a ruler, a market, and a tax, all of them resting on something as dull and colorless as a chunk of mineral. Salt was not just carried, it was calculated. The economics of empire. It's often said that the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were built on gold, and that's true. West Africa was rich in it, but gold does not move without infrastructure, and salt provided that. Why? Salt was consistent. Salt was divisible. Salt had practical utility in every household. Salt could be measured, taxed, and stored without spoiling. In essence, salt behaved like money. For rulers, that meant power. The early Ghana Empire, 6th–13th centuries, located in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, controlled key points between the Saharan salt mines and the gold fields of the south. While not directly producing either resource, the empire taxed everything that passed through its territory. A merchant entering Ghana's capital, Koum, by sail, might pay 1 gold dinar to bring in salt and another dinar when he left with gold. That might seem exploitative, but it was actually efficient. It regulated trade and funded stability, including the protection of caravans. Later, the Mali Empire, 13th–16th centuries, under rulers like Mansa Musa, took this model further. Mansa Musa's famed pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, where he reportedly spent so much gold he disrupted economies in Cairo, was made possible by revenue from trans-Saharan trade, in which salt played a key role. Every slab that crossed the dunes added weight to the empire. The bureaucracy of slabs. Let's break down the logistics and paperwork. Yes, even here in the dunes, there was bureaucracy. A typical salt caravan moving from Taoudeni to Timbuktu involved a camel master, the Azalai leader, responsible for organization, guides who knew the route, scribes or traders from sponsoring families, assistants, handlers, and cooks, security, either hired or tribal. Upon reaching trading towns like Timbuktu, Gao, or Jin, the salt was inspected, weighed, and officially valued. Depending on the location, this could be done by local judges, qadis, using Islamic law, appointed tax collectors from the ruler's court, merchant guild elders. In the Tariq al-Fatish, a 17th century chronicle of the Songhai Empire, there are descriptions of taxes being levied by the slab, with different rates for different grades of salt. In some cases, receipts were issued ink on scrolls or folded parchment. One historian describes small pieces of wood, notched to indicate salt transactions, accounting systems adapted to the desert. Salt became a ledger, and the empire was its bank. Slaves, salt, and the shadow trade. While salt was central to empire building, it also intersected with the West African slave trade. This was not the Atlantic slave trade of later centuries, but an older, trans-Saharan one. Enslaved individuals captured in warfare or raids were marched north across the desert to serve in North African households, farms, and armies. Salt caravans often carried human cargo as well as minerals. In some regions, Salt was even used to purchase slaves. This complicates the story. Salt was survival but also subjugation. Its movement was not always benign. For every camel kneeling to be loaded, there might have been a chained prisoner nearby, waiting to walk the same path but never return. Some modern historians debate the scale of this system, but its economic logic is clear. Salt created wealth and wealth funded war. War created captives, and captives became commodities. In this way, salt so simple, so white became entangled with human power. Infrastructure without iron. Most empires leave ruins, aqueducts, citadels, arches, fortresses. The salt empires of West Africa left sand, paper, and pathways. The roads were not paved. The cities, often made of mud brick, have crumbled, but if you look carefully, the infrastructure is still there. In the location of markets, in trade festivals that survive in towns like Agadez or Timbuktu, in family genealogies of traders whose ancestors crossed the Sahara, in oral histories carried not on paper but in memory. One such oral tradition from the Tuareg people tells of the camel that walked until the sky turned. The phrase is said to describe the Azalai journey, where desert mirages made the sun seem to bend and time seem to stall. Their words are not architecture, but they are structure. The decline of the salt roads. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the salt trade began to decline. Why? Political instability. Civil wars, invasions, and the fragmentation of empires made travel dangerous. Maritime trade. European ships along the West African coast made coastal trade more efficient. Colonial disruption. When French and British empires entered the interior, they ignored traditional routes and systems. Changing tastes and technologies. With industrialization, salt could be mined and refined more cheaply elsewhere. Some caravans still moved, especially in remote areas, but their economic centrality faded. By the 20th century, motor vehicles replaced camels, and the salt slabs of the Sahara became more symbolic than functional, yet they were not forgotten. In Mali and Mauritania, families still pass down recipes and rituals for using desert salt. In Timbuktu, you can find antique slabs in museums or as wall decor. In Taoyuani, salt is still cut by hand but only in small quantities, more for tradition than necessity. Slowness as sovereignty. Perhaps the most striking lesson of the salt roads is not about salt at all. It is about time. These systems worked because they were slow, methodical, and repetitive. They did not depend on breakthrough inventions or explosive growth. They were sustainable because they respected scale and risk. Empires were built not on speed, but on routine. Slowness in this case was not weakness, it was sovereignty. So now the desert is quiet again. The slabs have been offloaded. The camels rest. You sit in the shade of a wall built centuries ago with salt money, and you wonder, what would a society look like if it valued endurance more than innovation? The story ends where it began, in silence. There are no monuments to the salt caravans of the Sahara, no statues of the Azalai, no preserved camel tracks, no grand city gates announcing the arrival of 1,000 slabs of salt. The desert does not reward memory the way stone does. It erases footprints in hours, swallows ruins, and leaves only the wind. But the story is still there, if you know where to listen. This final section is about that memory, how the salt trade lingers in unexpected ways, in language, in architecture, in forgotten archives and living rituals. It is about how slow trade shaped a fast world, and how infrastructure built on patience outlasted the empires it served. The salt roads are not gone, they are hidden. The last caravans. In the far north of Mali, in a region so remote that satellites struggle to map it, there is a place called Taoyuani. It still functions today as a salt mine. The extraction methods have barely changed in centuries. Men dig wide, shallow pits with iron tools, sweat staining the sand. Salt crust is removed in square blocks, stacked and loaded onto camels. Not trucks, camels. Each year during the cooler season, a few hundred men still join a modern azalai, a salt caravan that travels nearly 400 miles to Timbuktu. The journey takes around 3 weeks. There is no luxury, no mechanical backup, just endurance and salt. They do not do this out of nostalgia. It is tradition, and in some regions it remains economically viable if just barely. Salt from Taoyuani is still traded in local markets. Some buyers prefer it over industrial salt. Others see it as a cultural good, like handmade cloth or traditional ceramics. But make no mistake, this is not a reenactment. It is a survival. Timbuktu's libraries, paper echoes of salt. In the heart of the Sahel, far from the Sahara's center, Timbuktu still holds another legacy of the salt roads: manuscripts. Thousands of them. These texts, written between the 13th and 19th centuries, document Islamic law, astronomy, medicine, and trade. Many are stored in family libraries, protected during centuries of turmoil, colonialism, and even recent insurgency. Some of these documents contain records of salt caravans, contracts specifying delivery dates, letters from merchants describing market conditions, religious rulings on fair trade in salt and slaves, medical treatises on salts, uses in treating wounds or preserving food. One document from the 15th century includes a currency conversion table, listing how many slabs of Taghesa salt equaled 1 dinar, 1 cow, or a young goat in the markets of Jen. These papers show that salt was not just muscle and sweat, it was administration. It required scribes, judges, and scholars. Timbuktu was a desert port and salt was its anchor. Architecture of salt and trade. In many Saharan towns, you can still find traces of trade-era wealth, though erosion has worn most down. Mud brick palaces in Gao and Jen, their forms derived from the commerce that salt supported. Warehouses with thick walls, designed to store slabs in cool, shaded interiors. Caravanserais, desert inns built at fixed intervals, where traders could rest with their animals. Some were maintained through endowments funded by salt profits. Religious schools, madrasas, sponsored by merchants who grew rich on desert logistics. Even town layouts reflect the salt roads. Main streets widen to accommodate camel unloading. Market squares are shaped not around plazas but flat, open expanses for stacking and sorting goods. Shade was currency, and the angle of awnings mattered. Salt-shaped space. Language, idioms, and memory. In several West African languages, salt retains special significance. In Hausa, the phrase "Yafai Jashiri," more valuable than salt, still denotes high worth. In Soninke, salt is associated with truth and preservation, likely a nod to both its physical and symbolic roles. In Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg, there are over a dozen terms for types of salt, depending on source, purity, and trade route. Even the Arabic word for money, mal, was historically interchangeable with goods like salt in many Saharan documents. The metaphors survive, and in them so do the roads. European encounters with the salt trade. When European explorers and colonial agents arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, many were stunned to find that the desert was full of economic movement. Scottish explorer Alexander Gordon Lyne, who reached Timbuktu in 1826, described massive stacks of salt as white tombstones lining the roads. He noted that salt seemed to matter more than anything else. Indeed, entire arguments in the marketplace could erupt over a crack in a slab. French and British officials quickly recognized the fiscal value of this trade. Some tried to tax it, others tried to redirect it, but most failed to replicate its scale. They could not see that the system worked not through innovation, but through trust, tradition, and tolerance for discomfort. It was not efficient by modern standards, but it was resilient. Colonial disruption and post-colonial realities. Colonial rule dismantled much of the Salt Road infrastructure not through active destruction, but through neglect and substitution. French administrators rerouted trade through coastal cities. Railroads and trucks bypassed the desert. Industrial salt production replaced artisanal mining. Formal borders divided previously continuous routes. By the mid-20th century, the great caravans were nearly extinct. Yet their ghosts linger. In older Tuareg men who can still recite desert paths by memory. In salt markets in Niger and northern Nigeria, where older women still inspect slabs like jewelers. In local economies where artisanal salt remains a badge of identity, even when cheaper alternatives are available. The Salt Road didn't end, it just changed lanes. What salt taught the world? It would be tempting to see the salt roads as a quirk of history, a logistical footnote, but they offer real lessons, particularly today. Infrastructure does not always require steel. Systems of transport and value can function without roads, engines, or electronics. All they need is trust, habit, and a shared need. Sustainability is not slow by accident. The salt caravans moved at the speed of endurance. They didn't exploit the desert, they adapted to it. Currency is cultural. Salt was money not because it was shiny or rare, but because it mattered to life. Geography shapes economics. The Sahara is harsh, but it connected worlds. The salt roads are proof that even the most barren landscape can be a bridge. The quiet road forward. In the desert, nothing is loud. There is no applause, no arrival bell. But salt remained, in bodies, in kitchens, in rituals. You may not think of it when you sprinkle it on your food, but a 1,000-year tradition lies beneath that motion. A network of camel drivers, a town made of salt, a scribe copying a contract by candlelight, a slab pulled from the earth by a man who will never be named. And the desert, watching silently, still holds the map. So now, as the caravan fades into dusk and the wind covers the tracks, one final question rests in the silence. What value endures when everything else is gone, but the need to survive? Story 6. The Republic of Pirates, Nassau's Forgotten Democracy. You are standing in the harbor of Nassau, Bahamas, sometime around 1717. The water smells of seaweed and old wood. Palm trees lean against Caribbean winds. A few ships sway at anchor, some with patched sails, some flying no nation's flag. There is no government here, at least not one you would recognize. No magistrate's court, no tax office, no army garrison. And yet the town functions. A man is elected to mediate disputes. Crew votes determine how plunder is divided. Injured sailors are compensated by agreement. The tavern keeper knows who settles debts and who doesn't. There are rules, strict ones. This is Nassau, a pirate haven. And for a brief moment in history, it became something else entirely. A quasi-democratic republic, formed not by philosophers or soldiers, but by outlaws. It's a strange chapter in colonial history, and one that most people, even students of empire, forget. Because it's not about treasure, it's about structure. The fall of order. Nassau did not begin as a pirate town. Originally established as Charlestown by the English in 1670, it was meant to serve as a small but strategic colonial outpost in the Bahamas. But the British government was far away, and the Caribbean was full of conflict. Between 1684 and 1703, Nassau was attacked, raided, or burned multiple times by the Spanish, by the French, and by privateers of all stripes. By the early 1700s, most of the formal British presence had abandoned the island. Into that power vacuum came pirates. And not just criminals, but displaced sailors, former privateers, and maritime refugees from global wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1700–1714, had employed thousands of seamen to attack enemy ships under legal commission. But when the war ended, the commissions disappeared and so did the jobs. Many chose piracy not out of greed, but out of necessity. Nassau, with its deep harbor and lack of oversight, became the ideal gathering point. By 1716, it was estimated that over 1,000 pirates called it home. That made it one of the most populous places in the Bahamas at the time. But here's the twist: they didn't descend into chaos, they organized themselves. The Articles of Agreement. If you imagine pirates as unruly anarchists, consider this. Most pirate crews operated under a strict set of written rules known as the Articles of Agreement. These weren't just guidelines, they were contracts, often signed or marked by every crew member before a voyage began. Common features included equal votes in major decisions, proportional division of plunder, e.g., the captain might receive 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, and ordinary crew 1. Compensation for injury, such as 600 pieces of 8 for a lost arm. Prohibitions against theft among crew, gambling on board, or bringing women aboard to avoid disputes. Dispute resolution through majority vote or arbitration by elected officers. These were not laws passed down by a king. They were negotiated agreements, revised over time, and enforced by collective action. In practice, pirate ships were floating democracies with captains elected and deposed at will. When these crews came ashore in Nassau, they brought that structure with them. It spread. The Republic emerges. What happened in Nassau between 1715 and 1718 is hard to define. It wasn't a nation. It had no borders, no flag, and no diplomatic standing. But it functioned like a state. Disputes among pirates from different ships were handled by agreed-upon arbiters. Supplies and repairs were coordinated, often with shared resources. Pirates pooled labor to fortify parts of the town, especially against possible Spanish attack. Locals and freed slaves lived alongside the pirates, sometimes as merchants, sometimes as sailors, sometimes as informal citizens. And leadership, it was fluid. One figure, Benjamin Hornigold, acted as an informal commander during this period. He discouraged attacks on British ships, claimed to act in defense of English liberties, and often took votes before major actions. Another, Samuel Bellamy, was famed for his egalitarian views and speeches on freedom and corruption. One pirate, Charles Vane, opposed this idea altogether and wanted chaos and conquest. He was eventually driven out. The pirates had voted him out. What emerged briefly was not a pirate kingdom, or even a confederation, but a kind of functional cooperative, a town where laws were made by consent, property was shared, and power flowed from the bottom up. No crown, no church, no empire, just consensus. Beyond fiction, historical evidence. It might sound romanticized, but records support this narrative. British reports from 1717, 1718 describe Nassau as in the hands of pirates and ruled by no known government. Letters from merchants in Jamaica and New York refer to Nassau as an unsafe republic or piratical community. Pirate trials held later in the decade often reference agreements made in Nassau, suggesting these arrangements had real weight. The term Republic of Pirates is not modern fiction. It appears in contemporary accounts, although sometimes as an insult. The historian Colin Woodard, whose book popularized the term, describes Nassau as one of the most successful pirate enclaves in history, not because it was wealthy, but because it was stable, at least briefly. It was not utopia, but it was unusual. The limits of liberty. There were problems, of course. Alcohol abuse was rampant, leading to internal disputes. Class tensions existed, especially between former officers and ordinary sailors. While pirates often freed enslaved people, some crews still participated in the slave trade. The British government began to see Nassau as a threat not just to trade, but to imperial order. And there was no real way to grow. Without agriculture, trade agreements, or formal alliances, the Republic of Pirates was fragile. It could not defend itself forever. It had no navy, no foreign support, and no central authority. But for a few years it worked. Why it mattered? Nassau's pirate republic offers a curious lesson in accidental governance. It was not designed by philosophers. It had no constitution or Enlightenment rhetoric. It was built on shared needs: protection, fairness, order amid lawlessness. And it emerged not in a capital, but on the margins of empire. It reveals how people, even those considered criminals, will create structure when institutions fail them. It shows that even among thieves, democracy finds a way. And so you sit in the shade of a ruined fort above Nassau Harbor, watching sails disappear into the blue. No anthem plays, no monument marks the site. But history was made here. And it leaves us with one final question. What happens when those cast out by the system build something better, if only for a while? The year is 1717, and you are aboard a sloop anchored just outside Nassau's harbor. The town is alive. Smoke from cooking fires spirals above thatched roofs. From the shoreline you hear laughter, hammers striking wood, and the occasional pop of a musket fired in celebration or warning. But above it all, you hear voices debating, negotiating, deciding. There is no crown in Nassau, no viceroy or chartered company, yet somehow order prevails, at least their version of it. In this section, we examine the leaders of this accidental republic, not tyrants or kings, but men who led by influence and consent. And we consider how the values of equality, autonomy, and justice, forged in desperation, created a short-lived but surprisingly functional society. Benjamin Hornigold, the reluctant admiral. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the first to gain influence in Nassau, not by conquest, but by pragmatism. A former privateer, Hornigold had experience in naval combat and organization. When others turned to piracy after the War of the Spanish Succession, Hornigold continued to attack only non-English ships. He insisted he was still serving England's interests. This was not a moral stance, but a strategic one. It protected Nassau's standing with English merchants and settlers. For several years, Hornigold effectively acted as the arbiter of Nassau. He didn't rule by force. He had no permanent fleet, but he had respect. When disputes arose between crews, Hornigold was often called in to mediate. He was viewed as balanced, reliable, and, importantly, sober, a rare virtue in pirate circles. But Hornigold's caution also made him enemies. When others began attacking English ships, seeing no real distinction between one flag and another, he resisted. Eventually, a vote was called. Hornigold lost. He was deposed as de facto leader by his peers. It was democracy in action, brutal, immediate, but bloodless. He didn't fight back. He simply stepped aside. Samuel Bellamy, the pirate philosopher. Samuel Black Sam Bellamy is less well documented than Hornigold, but his legend burned brighter. Described by contemporaries as charismatic and eloquent, Bellamy saw piracy not just as survival, but as justice. He allegedly said, "They rob the poor under the cover of law, while we plunder the rich under the cover of our own courage." Whether the quote is apocryphal or not, it reflects his known attitude. Bellamy framed piracy as a form of resistance not just to monarchy, but to corruption, inequality, and oppression. Under his command, ships operated as egalitarian collectives. Bellamy's men described him as generous, fair, and brave. He took votes before engagements, distributed spoils equitably, and personally intervened when mistreatment occurred. His brief presence in Nassau inspired many younger pirates, especially those recently dismissed from military service or who had suffered under cruel captains. Bellamy died young shipwrecked off Cape Cod in 1717, but his example lingered. He was not just a pirate, he was a symbol. In many ways, he was Nassau's ideal citizen, anti-authoritarian, principled, and inclusive. Charles Vane, the tyrant they rejected. Not every pirate in Nassau embraced democracy. Charles Vane was bold, cunning, and ruthless. He led many successful raids and commanded a fearsome ship, but his leadership style was autocratic. He believed in personal dominance. He flew the pirate flag as a threat, not a statement of rebellion. Vane disrespected the informal rules of Nassau. He hoarded wealth, disobeyed agreements, and brutalized prisoners unnecessarily. For a time, fear gave him followers. But that fear would not last. After refusing to accept a royal pardon from the British Crown, Vane attempted to consolidate control over Nassau, planning to fortify the town and establish his own rule. He was opposed by other pirates, including Hornigold and Calico Jack, Rackham. The crew of his own ship eventually voted Vane out of command democratic justice in the rawest form. He was cast adrift and later captured by British forces. Vane's downfall serves as a reminder. In Nassau, power without consent did not last. Even among thieves, there was a line. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, women at the edge of power. It is rare to find women in pirate histories, not because they weren't there, but because most records excluded them. Two notable exceptions are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both were aboard Calico Jack's ship during the final years of Nassau's independence. They dressed in men's clothing, fought in battles, and participated in the same decision-making processes as their male crewmates. Anne Bonny, in particular, was known for her sharp tongue and refusal to back down. When Calico Jack and others surrendered to British forces in 1720, Bonny reportedly told him, "If you had fought like a man, you needn't have been hanged like a dog." Though both women were later captured, their presence in Nassau reflects the social fluidity of the pirate republic. Unlike colonial society, rigid, hierarchical, gendered Nassau offered something more flexible. It was not a utopia, and prejudice surely remained, but it allowed space for those excluded from power elsewhere to make their mark. The British response: Woodes Rogers arrives. By 1717, British merchants and officials had had enough. Nassau was disrupting Atlantic commerce. Pirate raids were increasing. Insurance premiums were rising. More importantly, the very idea of a functioning society without royal sanction was deeply threatening. In 1718, the Crown sent Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned colonial governor, to bring Nassau to heel. He offered a royal pardon to any pirate who surrendered voluntarily, full amnesty, no prosecution. Many accepted. Hornigold did. Rackham did. Others fled. Some resisted. But the writing was on the wall. Rogers re-established colonial law. He built fortifications, commissioned local militias, and expelled known pirates. Within a year, the Republic was effectively over. The pirate ships were gone. The elected leaders were dead, imprisoned, or scattered. But the memory remained. Beyond the cannon smoke. The Republic of Pirates wasn't a political experiment like the American colonies or the French communes. It had no written constitution, no foreign recognition. But it worked for a time. And it did so in ways that contradict how we usually think about pirates. They were not disorganized, they were self-governing. They were not violent at random, they enforced rules and restitution. They were not tyrannical, they elected and deposed leaders based on merit. They were not exclusive, they included people from various backgrounds, races, and even genders. Nassau's democracy was not planned. It emerged organically, shaped by hardship and shared interest. And for a fleeting moment, in a forgotten corner of empire, it thrived. Now the waves wash over the ruined docks of Nassau. Tourists walk streets where mutinies once unfolded. Few know what this place once represented, not just rebellion but order without rulers. And you're left with a question that floats quietly in the Caribbean breeze. Can real democracy survive when the people have nothing but each other? The year is 1720. The Republic of Pirates is dying. Gone are the drunken celebrations on the beach, the cargo ledgers scrawled by candlelight, the debates between crews over how to divide the next capture. The cannons that once guarded Nassau's harbor are now turned inward, not against kings or nations, but against themselves. The dream of pirate democracy is unraveling. This final section is about how it ended, why it mattered, and what the pirates left behind: not just buried treasure, but a radical model of self-governance, built on consensus, survival, and the rejection of empire. Because sometimes, history's most fragile experiments hold the most enduring truths. The pardon and the problem. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718, he did not come with an army. He came with paper, specifically a royal proclamation of pardon, issued by King George I. It offered amnesty to any pirate who surrendered within a year. No trials, no hangings, just a chance to return to society. For many pirates, it was the first formal recognition they had ever received from the world of empires. Rogers didn't just bring clemency, he brought structure. A new governor's palace, fort renovations, merchants licensed to trade legally again, laws enforced with British backing. But the pardon came with a condition: no more independence, no more votes on who leads the harbor, no more decisions by shipboard councils, no more informal contracts or article-based agreements. For some pirates this was acceptable, for others it was betrayal. Among the holdouts was Charles Vane, who openly defied Rogers, raided English ships, and attacked smaller colonies. He was hunted, captured, and hanged in 1721. Many others scattered to the Carolinas, to Hispaniola, to the remote coves of Cuba and Florida. The center could no longer hold. The execution dock, end of the ideal. As the British reasserted control over Nassau and other pirate havens, trials followed. Some were in the Bahamas. Others took place in London, Jamaica, or Virginia. In nearly every case, pirates were tried as traitors and thieves, not political actors. They were not asked why they did what they did. They were not offered the chance to defend their communities or explain their code. Their governance, however brief and functional, was erased from the official record. All that remained were the charges: piracy upon the high seas. Between 1718 and 1726, over 400 pirates were executed across the British Empire. Many of them were former citizens of Nassau. Their hangings served as both punishment and propaganda. British officials wanted to make clear: no republic of rogues would be tolerated. The idea of democratic power outside empire was too dangerous to allow, even if it came from men with no homes, no wealth, and no navy. Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, and the Last Ship. In late 1720, John Calico Jack, Rackham, Anne Bonny, and Mary Read were captured after a skirmish off the Jamaican coast. Their trial became famous not for its legal drama, but for what it revealed. Bonny and Read were the only two pirates who resisted capture, fighting while the rest of the crew hid below deck. At their trial, both women claimed to be pregnant, which granted them temporary reprieve from execution. Mary Read died in prison. Anne Bonny disappeared from the record, with rumors suggesting she was released or escaped. Calico Jack was hanged, and his body displayed in an iron cage, a warning to other would-be rebels. This trio is often treated as pirate lore, but in many ways they represent the end of the Nassau experiment. They were not just pirates. They were symbols of its final generation born into a world of uncertainty, choosing autonomy over obedience and dying for the decision. What the Republic built and left behind. It's easy to dismiss the Republic of Pirates as a fluke, an accident of geography, timing, and desperation. But for a brief moment, it modeled something real. Democratic consensus over hierarchy. In a world ruled by monarchy and aristocracy, pirates elected their leaders. They wrote their own rules. They shared power horizontally. Social insurance and redistribution. Crews took care of their injured. They allocated funds for support. Articles provided social contracts that empires failed to offer. Multiracial and gender-inclusive practices. While far from egalitarian by modern standards, Nassau allowed for the inclusion of free black sailors, formerly enslaved people, and women in roles of influence more than most European societies of the time. Flexible, adaptive governance. Rules could be revised, leaders could be removed. The system was responsive, not rigid. In short, they created a functioning democracy, not despite their outlaw status but because of it. Their freedom was not a theory, it was a necessity. Pirate ideals in the modern imagination. Centuries later, the Republic of Pirates continues to influence modern media. Films romanticize its figures. Books mythologize its freedoms. Games depict its politics as chaotic but strangely just. But behind the swashbuckling and the spectacle lies something deeper, a model of cooperative autonomy, born in the margins, forged in hardship. Historians today increasingly view pirate societies not as failed states, but as alternative systems flawed, yes, but functional. And their greatest crime in the eyes of empire may not have been theft, but independence. The final tide. Stand now on the shoreline of modern Nassau. You'll find cruise ships, casinos, and shopping districts. British forts remain, now hollowed out and turned into museums. There are plaques for colonial governors. There are no monuments for Hornigold, Bellamy, Bonny, or Reed. But walk a little further past the resorts, past the noise, and you'll see the sea. It's the same sea. And if you listen long enough to the rhythm of the waves, you might still hear the echo of a question that once defined an entire harbor.